Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most fascinating characters in American history, someone whose name probably all of our listeners have heard of, maybe know something about, but perhaps don't know the full, fascinating, complex story of John Brown, American extremist. We're joined today by Professor Dan Monroe. Dan is a professor of history at Millikin University, has been the chair at Millikin for a number of years. He has also been connected with the Illinois Historical Society, leading there, and is the author of a number of important works on the 19th century, on political figures of the 19th century, historical currents of the 19th century. Dan is exactly the person we need to have this conversation. And I should also add that Dan is an absolutely terrific teacher. He teaches in our Ashbrook's Master of Arts in American History and Government program for teachers. He also teaches in our Teaching American History seminars on the Civil War, sectionalism, conflict, and more broadly, the 19th century, and also a terrific course on Hemingway. So we have a Renaissance man with us today and a deep and profound expert on the 19th century. Dan Monroe, thanks for taking the time to join us today again on The American Idea.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here always, and I'm delighted to join you. And thank you for that glowing introduction. I feel great now. I feel like I have all the answers.
Well, Dan, our listeners might not know this, but you look great too.
Thanks so much.
John Brown. Okay, a lot of people, especially our listeners, have heard of John Brown. Let me start by this question. We know his name. We might know the song John Brown's Body. We know something about him. I think even the rock group Kansas has one of their albums actually has the album cover is John Brown, amazingly enough. But is there anything in John Brown's biography prior to the 1850s that would have suggested that he was going to end up at Harper's Ferry in 1859, leading a violent raid in order to start a slave insurrection?
Well, I think the simple answer is no. I mean, John Brown prior to the 1850s was a bankrupt. He had, he had emerged from his father's tutelage as a tanner and was, fairly successful at that. But then he engaged in land speculation as part of his, kind of effort to rise in life, and was caught short by the Panic of 1837. And after that, he engaged in an unsuccessful wool business and got, which resulted in more debt. So he'd had a series of business failures and was effectively bankrupt by, the late 1840s, maybe early 1840s would be, I think, more accurate, and never really emerged from that. So prior to the 1840s, if you looked at John Brown's life, you would characterize him as someone who had failed, who had not done very well in a developing economy with lots of opportunities to do well.
He starts out, am I right to say, his family is from Connecticut, so they're New England Yankees, and then they move west. Tell us a little bit about his childhood, his upbringing, and again, does that have any connection to what will eventually become his militant abolitionism?
This is a great question. Yes, Brown is born in Connecticut. He comes from what might be characterized as Puritan stock. He's has a kind of very, very kind of Congregationalist Calvinist upbringing, with all the baggage that goes with that. I think it's fair to characterize him before the 1850s as kind of an Old Testament Christian. He follows in his father's footsteps and becomes kind of an artisan in terms of being someone who works with his hands. And he moves west to do that, opening a tannery first in Pennsylvania and then in the Western Reserve of Ohio. And he's fairly successful at being a tanner. And he has two wives. One bears him, I think, 5 or 6 children, then passes away at a very young age. And then he marries the woman that he hires to help with the chores around the house. Now that he's lost his wife, and he marries her and has additional children. I think he eventually fathers 20 children. So he's done fairly well as a tanner, but he gets involved in these business speculations I mentioned earlier, and ends up in bankrupt. But for our purposes, Brown dedicates himself to the anti-slavery cause. Now, his father was kind of vaguely anti-slavery, the way people in New England were, but was certainly never an activist, and or in any way, seriously committed. Brown develops a strong commitment to the anti-slavery cause. I think it gives his life purpose amidst his perpetual business failures. And the seminal moment in his dedication to the anti-slavery cause is the death of Elijah Lovejoy. Of course, Elijah Lovejoy was the famous abolitionist newspaper editor who was publishing an abolitionist newspaper in Alton, Illinois, after he was run out of St. Louis for doing the same there in a slave state. He crosses the river and comes up to Alton and continues his anti-slavery, and I should say, as an aside, also anti-Catholic activities, because Lovejoy, like a lot of early abolitionists in the what was called the West then, but today would be the Midwest, were often anti-Catholic as well. So, but that's another story. But Lovejoy is gunned down by the citizens of Alton, who did not want their business relationships with Southerners disrupted by potentially having their community develop as a kind of anti-slavery center of activity. So they kill him. This is in November of 1837. And when the news gets to Ohio, Brown famously dedicates his life in a public proclamation in a church at a memorial service for Lovejoy to the anti-slavery cause. And as time goes on, he becomes more and more zealous in that pursuit. And in the 1850s, he becomes quite militant.
So the Western Reserve of Ohio is just north of where we are in Ashland. I'm thinking of a town like Hudson, which even to this day, I believe in its town green has a plaque in memory of John Brown. Was Hudson, Ohio, was this area already abolitionist when John Brown got here?
That's a great question. I think that is that Brown is part of a cusp of a wave of anti-slavery sentiment in the Western Reserve. I think it predates him a little bit, but not by much. And he just imbues and enhances, that anti-slavery movement that is a highlight of that region in this period. The abolition movement has gotten off the ground in 1831 with the publication of the first number of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And and it's become a social movement, although it's always important to emphasize that the abolition movement as a social movement was a tiny minority of the northern population. Most Northerners were not favorably disposed to the abolition movement. So it was always an uphill battle. Of course, in the South, there was no abolition movement at all, certainly after 1832. But even in the North, there was strong sentiment against the abolition movement. It's something that Brown and Garrison and others fought against their entire anti-slavery careers.
So did he have relations? Where was he? What was his abolitionism like after 1837? Is he with William Lloyd Garrison? Is he with others like Frederick Douglass? Where does he sit in the panoply of abolitionists?
It's a great question. Garrisonian abolitionism emphasized pacifism, emphasized moral suasion, emphasized immediatism, emphasized not being involved in politics. Brown thought that abolitionism in the Garrisonian mode had failed. Uh, Now, he develops these views in the 1840s and certainly in the 1850s, but he's always much more accepting of the necessity of violence than Garrison ever was. And it just has to be said that Brown has a profound effect on Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass meets Brown, in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and Brown, shares his philosophy of the acceptability of violence with Douglass, and as part of Douglas's gradual migration from Garrisonian pacifism. Douglass, remember, escaped from slavery in 1838. Then he gets plugged into the abolition movement as a speaker by Garrison in 1841. And of course, he's a huge success because he's a marvelous speaker, a wonderful physical presence. But Douglass, for many years, was essentially on the same page as Garrison, and over time, by the late 1840s, he's in the process of breaking with Garrison, in part because he wanted to chart his own course and be allowed to say something beyond just attesting to his experience of slavery at meetings, at public meetings, anti-slavery meetings. But it's also because he disagrees with Garrison on issues. And one of the issues that he disagrees with is pacifism. Brown or Douglass, in part because of Brown's influence, becomes much more accepting of the idea that slavery is probably going to die a violent death. It's not going to be solved by pacifism. The slave owners aren't going to be persuaded by Garrisonian arguments to abandon their, multi-thousand-dollar cotton crop that results in them living a life of luxury that few in the period could imagine. I mean, I often tell students that, just to give an idea what I'm talking about, I often note that Jefferson Davis, who of course was a future Confederate president in the Senate and also the Secretary of War in the 1850s, had a plantation on the Mississippi River called Davis Bend that he rarely, if ever, visited. It was run by an overseer. But every year, the overseer delivered Jefferson Davis a check after he sold the cotton crop of between $30,000 and $35,000 in 1850s dollars. I mean, that would be equivalent to a seven-figure payoff in the days, at a time when there was no income tax. So the point is that you're going to be hard pressed to persuade people to give up that level of profitability, that level of monetary payoff. And I think Brown recognized that. Brown was much more open to a violent solution to the slavery conundrum, and key events like the death of Lovejoy, like the mini Civil War in Kansas after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. These things set Brown, or gave Brown, a reason or an incentive to embrace the violence that he had preached.
One of the things also, of course, that was a subject of lively debate among abolitionists at the time in the 1840s and 50s was not just pacifism versus violence, but also political engagement. Should we be engaged in politics? Should we form our own political party? Should we be part of one of the two political parties at that time, perhaps the Democrats and the Whigs, try and move them a direction? Did Brown ever get into politics in any way?
He did not, but like Douglass, he felt that the abolition movement should be, use whatever methods they could to propel the anti-slavery cause. One of the key reasons that Douglass broke with Garrison was that Douglass felt that eschewing politics, not getting involved in politics, was a terrible mistake. Garrison's argument was, well, politics of necessity is a business wherein you have to compromise. You might get a little grubby. You might have to make some kind of a deal to get your legislation passed. You might get half of a loaf rather than a whole loaf. And Garrison's argument was, well, because slavery is such a moral evil, it's so morally wrong, you can't accept half a loaf. Garrison was opposed to gradualism, which of course was a Lincoln solution. let's have a gradual compensated emancipation plan where we pay the owners to give up their charges, and it happens over a long period of time to prevent social disruption and tension. That was absolutely unacceptable to Garrison, and that was a political solution. Well, Brown and Douglas recognized that political involvement, even with those, the problem of, potentially having to compromise, not having an anti-slavery voice in Congress, not having an anti-slavery voice in a state legislature, not having an anti-slavery voice in a gubernatorial race, that's a problem. If you're abandoning the field of politics to one side, you're abandoning an opportunity to make your case in the venues that politics offers. So, you have the Liberty Party get on its legs in 1840, and you have anti-slavery congressmen in Congress all the way up to the Civil War. People like Owen Lovejoy in Illinois, who was, the brother of the martyred Elijah, who was a very staunch anti-slavery / abolitionist congressman from Northern Illinois. So although Brown, Brown with his serial business failures and how should I put this? His kind of general flakiness. Brown was never, I would say, was never a viable political candidate. He wasn't somebody that who could make a credible case for votes. And I think Brown sees his role as being, being an agitator anyway. Brown sees himself as an action man. He feels like Garrisonianism is, kind of milksop stuff. It's not strong enough. Whereas he has the true medicine. He's the man who's going to drive the course against slavery. And in the end, he comes up with that rather flawed, shall we say, insurrection plan.
So he's the man. The Garrisonians talk the talk. He wants to walk the walk. He gets his chance right in the 1850s because you've got the Compromise of 1850, especially the strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act, which enrages a lot of abolitionists. Then you also, as you mentioned, get the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. For some of our listeners who may not know that, what was that act and how did it precipitate what ended up being called Bleeding Kansas, where John Brown gets maybe his first taste of anti-slavery violence?
So Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator, the longtime senator from Illinois and Democrat, is the chair of the Senate Committee on the Territories. And Douglas had been trying to organize the Nebraska Territory, which was the northern portion of the Louisiana Purchase, for a long time. And his efforts were constantly blocked by Southern senators because they recognized that region was probably going to come in, after the territorial phase, probably going to come in as free states. And the Southern advantage that came from the 3/5 rule, in terms of the Electoral College and in terms of additional seats in Congress, was gradually kind of being whittled away by immigration that predominantly went into the North. In 1860, the population of the North is 22 million and the population of the South is 9 million, to give you an idea what we're talking about. So the upshot is Southerners didn't want to organize that Nebraska Territory because out of it would come free states. In January of 1854, Douglas, I'm talking about Stephen A. Douglas, comes up with a solution to this problem. And the solution is he abandons the Missouri restriction. The Missouri restriction prohibited slavery above the southern border of Missouri, which is 36 degrees, 30 minutes line. And everything above that was free and everything below that was slave. That was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Douglas abandons that specifically in the legislation. And the Southern senators, like David Atchison from Missouri, were delighted. And so they support the organization of Nebraska, but they ask that the territory be divided into two territories now, Nebraska and Kansas Territory, which Douglas also accedes to. So that's the legislation. It passes the Senate. There's a long House debate. Meanwhile, Douglas has enlisted Franklin Pierce, Stephen Douglas, I'm talking about, elicits Franklin Pierce's support, and he makes it a Democratic Party measure. And so, in other words, if you were going to be a loyal Democrat, you had to support it. And it passes by June of 54, the law of the land. This leads to tremendous consequences. The Democratic Party fragments over this. Northern Democrats are very upset, or a certain faction of them, and actually leave the party. And there's a formation of an anti-Nebraska coalition that's made up of Democrats who are upset with Kansas, Nebraska, with Whigs who really don't have a party anymore because the Whig Party's kind of fizzled out after the 1852 election, and Free Soilers and nativists. They're all ticked off about the Kansas-Nebraska Act passing. And this coalition becomes the Republican Party in 1855. Meanwhile, while this kind of political turmoil is going on, settlers from the North and the South are flocking into Kansas, some of them imbued with the idea that they should turn Kansas into a free state, and counterparts from the South, and particularly Missouri, who were migrating in to make it a slave state. By virtue of leaving the question, this was the other angle to the bill, was that Stephen Douglas argued that the question of slavery will be determined by popular sovereignty, or to let the people of the territories decide. So you've created this condition for both sides to flock into that region and try to claim it for their own, and eventually they start fighting. One more thing to mention about this act is that after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Democratic Party, it's still a national party, but it's increasingly dominated by the South, by Southern political figures, because many Northern Democrats had abandoned the party and had joined this anti-Nebraska coalition that eventually forms or turns into the Republican Party that exists to this day.
Mm. So when settlers are pouring in, because as you say, whoever gets the most people there and there's a vote, they can decide whether it's going to be a slave state or a free state. With settlers pouring in, so John Brown leaves from the east, heads west to engage in what? Does he think that he's going to go there and do politics? Does he think there needs to be violent solution? What's John Brown's plan when he gets there?
It's a great question. And Brown had this, of course, immensely large family. And some of his sons had decided that they were going to go to Kansas and help make it a free state. They were committed to the anti-slavery cause just like their father was. So his sons, 6 of his sons migrate to Kansas, and then Brown decides to follow along. I think somewhat reluctantly. By this time, Brown is 50, in his mid 50s, 55 years old, and he, he's by the, by the, by the standards of the time, at age 55 in 1855 is old. He's an old man. But he goes anyway. He's committed to the anti-slavery cause, and he joins with his sons. And inevitably, when the fighting starts, and there's, the kind of typical nasty kind of guerrilla warfare, kind of atrocities, bushwhacking, sniping one side at the other, and then eventually open warfare in the formation of militia units fighting against each other, free state and pro-slavery settlers. Brown gets heavily involved in that, and is kind of given the rank of captain. He's referred to as Captain Brown, and leads men against pro-slavery forces.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with 2 different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
At the time, I think there's a phrase, John Brown's Bibles.
Yeah, right.
What's that?
So some of these anti-slavery societies, like the New England Immigrant Society, were sending guns, which of course was illegal. You weren't supposed to be sending lots of guns, and the federal government was trying to police some of the things that were coming in. So well, they did a very poor job, obviously. But to kind of secretly bring arms in, they would pack the rifles in cases that were labeled John Brown's Bibles, or Bibles simply. So when they opened them up and found firearms, and they said, well, here's more of John Brown's Bibles. And Brown was actively involved in the resistance to the pro-slavery movement, and as you know, engaged in actual open murder of pro-slavery settlers.
Yeah, tell us about that and his involvement directly, not just supporting the anti-slavery militias in their fight, supplying them with weapons, but actually himself engaging in conflict and in fact killing people.
Yes, Brown, he's leading this kind of a rump militia group that includes his sons. And in the wake of the caning of Charles Sumner, Charles Sumner in May of 1854 was caned by a Southern congressman on the floor of the U.S. Senate, that is to say, beaten, because he'd given what offense when he gave a speech criticizing slavery and referred to his colleague Andrew P. Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina, in what was regarded as an insulting way. He basically said that Butler was in love with a harlot, and the harlot was slavery. Well, a harlot was a antebellum term for a prostitute. So in consequence, Butler's cousin, relative, Preston B. Brooks, who was a House member, walked across to the Senate and assaulted Sumner on the floor of the Senate with a cane, beating him over the head, causing a concussion and generally scandalizing the entire United States. Brown hears about this and he's incensed. And there's some other things going on by pro-slavery forces in Kansas too that also gets his blood up. So in May of 1854, Brown and his sons and some of their Confederates went along pro-slavery settlers' cabins along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, and pulled 5 men out of their cabins in the middle of the night and killed them, hacking them up with broadswords, shooting them. It was referred to through history as the Pottawatomie Massacre. This is the beginning of Brown's reputation for ruthlessness, for a willingness to shed blood, which I think was well deserved. I mean, it was pure cold-blooded murder. There's no other way to characterize it. I mean, Brown, murdered people along Pottawatomie Creek, and there's no kind of silver lining to that. Soon after that, there's a big battle between pro-slavery militia and Brown. I think the pro-slavery militia attempted to kill Brown and wipe him out at the Battle of Osawatomie, and Brown manages to survive, although one of his sons is killed in the fighting. And in the wake of that, Brown leaves Kansas, I think in part because his reputation was such in Kansas that it was probably safer for him to get out for a while. But also, he wants to take some of these exploits and go back to New England and do some fundraising for the anti-slavery cause. And he's also, kind of germinating or thinking about this plan of his to lead a slave insurrection in the South.
So after he leaves Kansas in the mid-1850s, then he heads back east, as you say. He starts ruminating on this plan. Tell us about the plan, the thing for which he's probably most famous, the raid in 1859 on Harper's Ferry.
Yeah, it's somewhat analogous to the kind of the Spartacus revolt in ancient Rome, where Spartacus, the slave, led a revolt of gladiators, and they went from Roman estate to Roman estate and killed all the Romans and freed the slaves, and then eventually formed a slave army that in the end was crushed, by a massive army of Roman legions. Brown thought that he could do something similar, that if he could go into the South, he could he could arm the slaves. He would be kind of a rallying point for the slaves. So if he could go to the South and get arms, the slaves would leave their plantations and rally to him, and then he would take them up into the mountains, and over time he would form this kind of slave army. And at his trial, Brown denied that he was engaged in any kind of bloody insurrection. His argument was that just by virtue of creating this force that would be up in the Appalachian mountain chain, it would a kind of unassailable force, he would draw these slaves to them, and slavery as an institution would be untenable and would kind of collapse of its own weight. I think the fact that it may be more realistic to suggest that Brown did intend to lead a slave insurrection, despite what he said at his trial. But none of it. I mean, his entire conception was flawed from the beginning. His choice of locations for the insurrection, Harper's Ferry, is, as Frederick Douglass characterized it, as a perfect trap. Indeed, Brown meets with Frederick Douglass before the raid and tries to convince him to go along with it, and Frederick Douglass declines because he says, you're just going to get yourself killed. It's not going to work. But he does enlist support. You were talking about his tour of New England. He does enlist support from a number of New England abolitionists, leading figures who give him money and house him and feed him and give him venues to give anti-slavery speeches. Now, he doesn't precisely lay out in a public setting what he plans to do. It's just kind of vague support for his anti-slavery crusade, but it's clear that this is what he intended and had this conception for a long time. Let me just say kind of parenthetically before I shut up and let you ask another question. John Stauffer has written a fabulous book on Brown and the abolition movement, and one of Stauffer's argument is that Brown was making a conscious attempt to internalize a Black identity. That is to say, Brown was very sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause, was sympathetic to Black people, Black Americans in slavery, and so much to the point that Brown consciously tried to put himself in the place of Black people. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think Brown was so sympathetic to Black Americans that he welcomed them into his home, referred to them as Mr. and Mrs., which very few white men or white people in general did to Black Americans in this period. I think that's part and parcel of why he was so zealous, was that he had this overwhelmingly sympathetic view of Black Americans, and indeed to the point of attempting to identify with them.
What happens then on that fateful day in 1859?
So Brown takes 22 men and they hole up in a farmhouse near Harper's Ferry, which is the location of a federal armory. On the evening of October the 16th, they assault the armory, which is guarded by just some hapless watchmen. And so they take it over. The armory does have modern weaponry, but Brown didn't cut the telegraph lines. He allowed a train that was steaming into town to steam back out of town. So the alarm was given, and Harper's Ferry was quickly surrounded by Virginia militia. Now, keep in mind that Virginia had gone through a slave revolt in 1831, the Nat Turner Revolt, which was a very bloody revolt, and it was suppressed ruthlessly after a month. And so, and it terrorized the white South. The fact that the revolt actually got off the ground and, Nat Turner and his men, killed whites, 55 of them. But the upshot is Virginia had been preparing for this, for this eventuality for 30 years. And now Brown comes along and, seizes the armory. And so once the alarm is given, the Virginia militia piled into that town, as they'd been prepping to do for decades. and they quickly surround the engine house where Brown is located with his men, and he's cut off. There was a possibility for him to leave early on, but he chooses not to. Lots of historians argue that Brown is consciously choosing martyrdom. I'm not so sure, simply because it's hard to say with any definitively. I'm always reluctant to argue that I know what a dead person is thinking,
Right.
absent absence a piece of paper. If Brown had written down, well, I didn't leave the engine house because I'm choosing martyrdom, well, I'd go with that. But we don't have that. You can infer that from his actions, but it's hard to come to the definitive conclusion, at least in my view. But the upshot is he's surrounded in that engine house by Virginia militia, and his position is untenable.
So he surrenders or is captured.
It's captured,
and is put on trial. At his trial, you mentioned some of the things he already said. Was he unrepentant at his trial?
Yes, he was. I mean, I think Brown's trial is leads inexorably to his apotheosis in the North. He essentially argues that he is acting in a kind of Christ-like way. He's sacrificing himself to expiate the sin of slavery, to try to save Black Americans from bondage. He had engaged in this effort and he had failed, but he was perfectly content to die because the cause in which he had failed was a noble one. So he adopts this almost Christ-like persona. He had attempted to expiate or eliminate this sin, and he had failed. So now he's giving his life, and Brown gives a memorable address. There's a court proceeding. It's handled by Virginia at its insistence, although he was technically, the federal government should have tried him since he had attacked a federal installation. But Buchanan, the feckless James Buchanan, hands it off to the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise. They prosecute under Virginia's treason laws. And so they have this rather speedy trial, and Brown is convicted and sentenced to death. So he's allowed, of course, to speak at the sentencing portion of the trial, and he gives this memorable address in which he argues that as a Christian, he was following the admonishment to aid the poor, to assist the downtrodden. It's a very New Testament address, and touches on the themes of Christ's life, that you have an obligation as a Christian to help those who are at the bottom of the social ladder. And that goes all out into the United States. It's broadcast across the country and strikes a ready tone with people in the North already fired up from the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, that coursed over the country over the preceding 30 years. So, when Brown is hung on December the 2nd, 1859, you have Northern churches ringing their bells in acknowledgement and tribute to his death and mourning. Even a kind of mainstream Whig turned Republican like Abraham Lincoln had to acknowledge that, Brown's death was regrettable, although also his course in choosing violence was regrettable as well. So Brown has, and the consequences of this are immense. I mean, the fact that the North, in part in response, I think, to Brown's use of Christian imagery, the fact that the North paid tribute to him enraged the South. Absolutely enraged the South. To them, if you look at Southern newspapers in the period, they're erupting at the fact that the North was lionizing Brown. Here's a man who was leading slaves to cut our throats, and the Northern response is not to condemn him, but to celebrate him. So David Potter makes the point in his magnificent book, The Impending Crisis, which is on the run-up to the Civil War, Potter makes the point that after Brown's raid, Southern Unionism declines precipitously, and I think he's exactly right. I mean, you see Southern newspapers in the wake of Brown's raid that had been staunchly Unionist in their editorials, now writing, well, maybe this whole union is just too damn dangerous. You know, this whole union with the North may be hazardous to us because the North is full of John Browns who are trying to lead a slave insurrection to kill us all. So the consequences of Brown's raid are immense. They damage Southern Unionism in a way that I think becomes irrevocable. It doesn't ever recover, and gives the false impression that the North is full of John Brown abolitionist types. So that when Lincoln wins election, you know, the following year, for God's sakes, you know, just a calendar year later, he's even though his entire life is one big argument for moderation on slavery, on a moderate anti-slavery approach, Lincoln is viewed as this dangerous radical because of the impression that John Brown has left.
So, and one of the things that Brown says, I think at the speech that you mentioned that he gives at his trial, is that he became convinced that slavery would only be purged away with blood. And some people have said that's Brown's prophecy of the Civil War. Based on what you're saying, is it too much to say that John Brown is one of the causes of the U.S. Civil War?
I think that's perfectly accurate. That's what I argue in my Civil War class. And that's right. I mean, that's one of his statements that kind of echoed through the ages and had a profound effect at the time. Brown's prediction that slavery was going to die a bloody death, which of course was very prophetic. But yes, I think my view is that Brown, like Potter, I agree. Brown had such a profoundly negative effect on Southern Unionism that he helped propel the country into war the following year when Lincoln is elected. Now, it has to be said that the Democratic Party in 1856 had consciously adopted an effort to tar the Republican Party as in favor of racial equality, which it was not. You know, the Republican Party was in favor of resisting the expansion of slavery, but not necessarily racial equality. There were some Republicans who were in favor of racial equality, but there were many who were not. But the Democratic Party made a conscious effort of suggesting that that's exactly what the Republican Party was about. They referred to the Republican Party as the Black Republican Party in an effort to make that link. They started doing this in 1856, and they continue to do this really all the way into and through the Civil War. So when, in other words, the Democratic Party has created this, is attempting to create a public perception of the Republican Party as dangerously radical on race issues. Then you have John Brown come along and lead a slave insurrection in freaking Virginia. And northern churches are ringing their bells in mourning. And people like Henry David Thoreau are writing articles, and Ralph Waldo Emerson are writing articles in tribute to Brown and suggesting that he's an angel of light. So that, you talk about consequences. I mean, from the Southern perspective, and I am in no way in sympathy with the secession movement, as everybody who's ever had me knows. But from a Southern perspective, what they're seeing suggests a radicalism on slavery and on race equality that really doesn't exist in the Northern majority. But Brown helped aid that perception.
Brown, throughout his life, this episode is entitled "American Extremist." We've talked a lot about the extremism of John Brown.
Yes.
What about the Americanism of John Brown? You talked a lot about how his abolitionism was rooted in his Christianity. Was it also rooted in other American ideas or principles or documents like the Declaration of Independence?
This is a great question, and I think the answer is yes. I mean, Brown famously says that there are two things that he would rather die than give up, and those are the Declaration of Independence and the Bible. my Christianity and the Natural Rights Creed. Those things were central to his existence. So this of course begs the question: should we celebrate Brown? Is he a terrorist who should be condemned, or is he someone who is leading an anti-slavery crusade that was long overdue? Because slavery was antithetical to the natural rights republic that the founders set up. And I think the answer is, is an ambiguous one. I mean, there's no doubt that Brown committed murder at Pottawatomie Creek. I mean, they went out and they dragged post-slavery settlers out of their cabins in the middle of the night and hacked them up, which was an act of murder. On the other hand, Brown was engaged in a noble endeavor. I mean, he was engaged in a fight against an archaic, brutal institution that had passed its expiration date, and that Garrisonian abolitionism had really failed to do anything about. So in some respects, Brown is perfectly consistent with the American credo of liberty over tyranny, of liberty over oppression, or liberty over exploitation. And I think he recognized that. I mean, his fealty to the Declaration certainly is consistent with Thomas Jefferson's argument that the tree of liberty has to be watered with blood on occasion. Brown, that's a sentiment that Brown would certainly agree with.
If our listeners want to get to know John Brown even more deeply after this really wonderful conversation, what do you recommend that they read or watch?
There's a wonderful biography of John Brown that David S. Reynolds did that I highly recommend. John Stauffer's book on the abolition movement is called The Black Hearts of Men. And what he means by that is he's describing white people who were identifying with the plight of Black Americans in bondage is very good. Those are two excellent books that I recommend. There's also the American Experience documentary, John Brown's Holy War, that PBS did at the beginning of the century. I think it's 2002, 2003. So it's 20 years old, but it holds up very well. I show it in all my classes. I show it in the sectionalism class for the Maggie program at Ashland. And the teachers love it. They go and use it in their own classes. So those are things that you can consult if you're interested in learning more about John Brown, and they're all richly rewarding.
Fascinating. What an amazing, interesting, complex human being John Brown was. Dan, thanks for taking the time to help us get to know him and his significance a little bit better.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to be part of the Ashbrook Center.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.